Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds, hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We continue with our early America series by looking at sectionalism and civil war. This is the full topic, so this one is longer than the individual lessons. Check the description down below for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet that goes along with this video. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. I do my best. Alright, now let's go. Conflicts and compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was like a fragile peace treaty between free and slave states. It kept things balanced and banned slavery north of the 30-60-30 line in the Louisiana Purchase. Problem solved, right? Not so fast. In 1848, the U.S. won a huge chunk of land from Mexico, and suddenly, nobody knew what to do with it. Would slavery be allowed there? Cue the political chaos. Northerners wanted to slam the brakes on slavery, fearing the South would get too powerful if it spread. Enter Representative David Wilmot, who boldly proposed the Wilmot Proviso, banning slavery in all new southwestern lands. It zoomed through the House but hit a roadblock in the Senate. Meanwhile, Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan had a genius, or extremely vague idea: popular sovereignty. Let the people in each new state decide for themselves. Sounds democratic, right? Well, Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was not having it. He demanded that slavery be allowed everywhere in the Western territories. The South was already on edge, worried that if free states outnumbered them in the Senate, they'd lose all power. Things got spicier in 1848 when anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats teamed up like an early version of a political supergroup and formed the Free Soil Party. Their slogan: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Catchy. They even ran former President Martin Van Buren for office, though he didn't exactly take home the trophy. Then came California in 1849, not just gold rush fever, but also a political crisis. California wanted in as a free state, but the South saw this as a massive threat. Some Southern leaders even threatened to secede. Cue dramatic gasps. Enter Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, the ultimate compromiser. He made over 70 speeches trying to calm everyone down. Someone get this man a lozenge. Eventually, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850, a deal that tried to make everyone happy. The North got California as a free state and no more slave trade in D.C. The South got popular sovereignty in new territories and a harsh new Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a nightmare for abolitionists. It let officials arrest anyone accused of escaping slavery without a trial. One white person's word was enough to send someone back into slavery. Worse, Northerners were required to help catch escapees. Many were not thrilled about this new side job. Then in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe dropped a literary bombshell: Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book told the emotional story of a kind slave and his brutal master. It shocked thousands of Northerners who had previously ignored the slavery issue. The South, however, dismissed it as Northern propaganda. And just like that, tensions kept rising, setting the stage for an even bigger showdown: growing tensions. By 1854, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas had a brilliant or disastrous idea. Let's create two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and let the people decide on slavery through popular sovereignty. A fancy way of saying, you guys figure it out. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically undid the Missouri Compromise, and Northerners were not happy. But with Southern support, the act passed, and that's when things got real messy. Welcome to Bleeding Kansas, the Wild West of politics. In 1855, Kansas held a vote on whether to be a free or slave state. Thousands of pro-slavery Missourians hopped the border and voted illegally because, hey, why not? A pro-slavery government was declared legit, but anti-slavery Kansans weren't buying it. They set up their own government, and suddenly Kansas had two rival governments because one just wasn't dramatic enough. Violence broke out, and soon Kansas was less like a peaceful prairie and more like an action movie. Towns were burned, people were attacked, and the territory earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. But the violence wasn't just in Kansas. It hit the U.S. Senate too. After Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gave a fiery anti-slavery speech, South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks, Sumner's nephew, responded with a cane. He brutally beat Sumner on the Senate floor because apparently that was how debates worked now. Southerners cheered, while Northerners saw it as proof that slavery was brutal and out of control. Enter the Supreme Court with the Dred Scott decision, 1857. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, argued that since he had lived in free states, he should be free. The U.S. Supreme Court disagreed, big time. The court ruled Scott had no right to sue because enslaved people weren't citizens. Living in a free state didn't make someone free. Congress could not ban slavery in territories. Translation: the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and slavery could technically spread everywhere. Northerners were outraged. New party, who dis? By this time, the Whig Party completely fell apart. Red Whigs. Anti-slavery Whigs joined forces with others to create the Republican Party, which was all about stopping slavery from spreading. The Republicans gained a ton of seats in Congress in 1854, but in 1856, Democrat James Buchanan still won the presidency. Lincoln versus Douglas, the political main event, 1858. A little-known Illinois Republican named Abraham Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for a Senate seat. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist, but he thought slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong. The two men debated in front of massive crowds, basically the 19th century version of a viral Twitter feud. Douglas won the election, but Lincoln became a national figure. John Brown, the North's martyr, the South's worst nightmare. John Brown, an abolitionist with zero chill, decided slavery had to go by force. In 1859, he and his small band attacked a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, planning to arm enslaved people and start a massive rebellion. The plan failed. Brown was captured and executed, and Southerners panicked. They were convinced that the North was out to destroy their way of life. And just like that, the U.S. was one step closer to civil war. By 1860, the debate over slavery had ripped the country apart. The Democratic Party was supposed to unite behind one candidate, but, surprise, they totally imploded instead. Southern Democrats wanted full-throated support for slavery. Northern Democrats said, yeah, no. The party split like a bad breakup. Meanwhile, some Southerners, desperately hoping to avoid disaster, formed the Constitutional Union Party, basically the political equivalent of taping a "Keep It Together" sign on a sinking ship. With pro-slavery votes divided, guess who won? That tall, bearded guy from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Honest Abe had entered the chat. The South, we're out of here. The second Lincoln won, the South freaked out. To them, this was proof that they had zero say in the federal government anymore. South Carolina wasted no time. Boom, first state to secede. 6 more followed like dominoes. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president because nothing says new government like recycling old names from the U.S. Lincoln, guys, let's not do anything crazy. At his first inaugural address, Lincoln basically said, I don't want to mess with slavery where it already exists. Secession isn't legal though, so awkward. Government only works if we all agree to follow the rules. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis's inaugural speech was like, government only works if the people consent to be governed. We don't consent anymore. Bye. And then, boom, the Confederacy started seizing federal property left and right, post offices, forts, anything with the U.S. flag. But one place stood firm, Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The U.S. commander refused to surrender, so Confederate forces opened fire. After a fierce bombardment, the fort fell, and just like that, the Civil War had officially begun. And now, war. The Confederacy grew to 11 states determined to defend their way of life, aka slavery. Meanwhile, the North fought to save the Union. What started as a messy election ended up as a full-blown war. And the rest, well, let's just say history class is about to get intense. The course of war. The North had a solid game plan, the Anaconda Plan. 1. Take the Mississippi River, so the South couldn't move troops or supplies, and to cut the Confederacy in half. 2. Capture Richmond, Virginia, because taking the enemy's capital is always a power move. 3. Blockade southern ports, so the South couldn't sell cotton or buy weapons, basically an early version of no Wi-Fi, no life. Meanwhile, the South had a very advanced strategy, play defense and wait for the North to get tired. Bold move, Cotton, let's see if it pays off. Ironclads, when ships got a glow-up. Both sides rolled out ironclads, warships covered in metal, because wooden ships were so last century. Thanks to these floating tanks, the Union kept its blockade strong. Bull Run, the Union's not-so-great start. The North thought, we'll just win one big battle and call it a day. The South responded, Lowell, no. First Battle of Bull Run, July 21, 1861, near Manassas, Virginia. The North charged in, expecting an easy W. The South held firm. Union troops panicked and ran away like it was Black Friday at Walmart. After this humiliating defeat, Lincoln brought in a new general, George McClellan, a guy who was very good at training soldiers and very bad at actually fighting battles. McClellan's great campaign. McClellan took his sweet time, months, preparing to march toward Richmond. When he finally moved, the Confederates stopped him, and by June, the Union was once again retreating. Lee takes the fight to the north. Confederate General Robert E. Lee was not about to sit back and wait. He invaded Maryland, forcing McClellan to abandon his Richmond plans. Battle of Antietam, September 1862, Maryland. The North finally attacked. The South retreated, but it was still the bloodiest single day of the war. Lincoln was not impressed with McClellan's hesitation and fired him. New general, same disaster. Lincoln's next pick, General Ambrose Burnside, immediately proved why sideburns were his best feature. Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside's plan? Charged straight into Confederate gunfire. The result? Absolute carnage. The Union lost badly. Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1863. The Union was defeated again despite outnumbering the South 2-1. But the South also took a big hit. General Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men, awkward. Meanwhile, in the West, Grant gets stuff done. While the Eastern generals were fumbling the bag, Ulysses S. Grant was out here winning battles. Captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, February 1862. Won the brutal Battle of Shiloh, April 1862. By June, the Union had nearly full control of the Mississippi River. So, while the East was a hot mess, Grant was proving that the North actually knew how to win a war. Emancipation and life in wartime. At the start of the Civil War, Lincoln's main goal wasn't to end slavery. It was to keep the Union intact. He didn't love slavery, but he didn't want to risk pushing the border states, the states on the fence about secession, into joining the Confederacy by making slavery the top priority. Besides, most Northerners weren't exactly marching to war to free enslaved people. But by 1862, Lincoln had a wait a second moment. He realized that slavery was literally fueling the Southern war effort. So on January 1, 1863, he dropped the Emancipation Proclamation, which, spoiler alert, didn't actually free anyone right away. However, it made the war about something bigger. Freedom. Well, freedom-ish. African Americans, we can fight too. At first, African Americans couldn't even join the Union Army. It wasn't until Congress changed the law in 1862 that African American soldiers could enlist. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment became one of the most famous and successful African American units. Meanwhile, Southern enslaved people did their best to avoid helping the Confederacy. The moment the Union Army was in sight, many of them took the opportunity to run for freedom like it was an extreme sport. Conditions that made you want to stay home. Let's just say the battlefield wasn't exactly a spa. Soldiers were basically human targets for cannonballs and bullets. Add to that new weapons technology and diseases like pneumonia and malaria, and you've got a recipe for a disaster. Soldiers didn't just fear enemy fire. They feared dying from an infected wound or, the flu. The draft. It's mandatory, but you can pay someone else. Both sides introduced a draft, which basically meant you're fighting whether you like it or not. The twist? If you were Northern and rich, you could just pay someone to fight in your place. On the Southern side, slave owners were also off the hook. So poor people in both the North and South got stuck doing the hard work while the wealthy avoided it. Unsurprisingly, draft riots broke out in northern cities in 1863, with everyone protesting how unfair it was that the rich were skipping out on the fun. Tax time, War Edition. Both the North and South introduced income taxes to fund the war. But since taxes didn't go far enough, they also printed paper money, which led to some serious inflation. In the South, prices skyrocketed and people were paying more for food than a celebrity endorsement on Instagram. Southern economy, a hot mess. The Southern economy was in total shambles. With the Union blockading their ports, no cotton trade, and land destroyed by constant battles, Southerners were facing food shortages and watching their livelihoods go up in smoke. Meanwhile, the Northern economy was thriving. Their industries grew, and businesses were cranking out supplies for the war effort. It was like the North was playing a different game entirely. Women, stepping up when men stepped out. Women on both sides of the war stepped in to take over the roles their men used to have. They ran businesses, farms, worked in factories, and even served as nurses and teachers. If they couldn't fight on the front lines, they were definitely doing the behind-the-scenes hustle to keep the war machine running. So while men were busy with war, women were busy being absolute legends. The war's end. After a couple of years of Confederate victories, which, let's be honest, were getting a little too frequent for comfort, the North finally got its act together. General Grant, not known for his subtlety, decided it was time to take on Vicksburg, Mississippi, one of the last Confederate strongholds on the mighty Mississippi River. Grant decided to go for the long game and laid siege to the city for 2 months, basically the military version of saying, "You're not going anywhere until you admit defeat." The city finally surrendered on July 4. Talk about a patriotic way to lose. With that, the entire Mississippi River was now under Union control. Gettysburg, the battle of, "We've got this, right?" Meanwhile, General Lee, apparently not one to sit quietly after a few victories, launched another attack in the north. This time, it was in Pennsylvania, because if you're going to lose a war, you might as well make it dramatic. At the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, Lee's army clashed with General George Meade's Union forces. The Union won after 3 days of intense fighting, and Pickett's charge, basically an ill-fated attempt at a bold, last-ditch Confederate attack, resulted in a bloodbath for the South. Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's epic speech. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln showed up to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen soldiers at Gettysburg. His speech, now known as the Gettysburg Address, was short, sweet, and very to the point. He basically told the nation, "Hey, we're all equal here, and this war is about freedom. Let's fix this mess." His words went down in history, making him a political rock star. Grant gets the job, and Sherman gets wild. After Vicksburg, Lincoln put General Grant in charge of the Union Army because he liked what he saw, a no-nonsense guy who didn't waste time. Grant then sent General Philip Sheridan to tear up Virginia, literally. The goal, destroy anything the Confederates could use, farms, livestock, transportation, and basically all the things that made Southern life tick. Total war. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman was on a similar mission in Georgia, which became famous as his March to the Sea. It was like a wartime road trip, except instead of souvenirs, they left devastation from Atlanta to Savannah. This kind of destruction didn't sit well with Southerners, but it did help Lincoln win re-election in 1864. Go figure. Lincoln's second inaugural: liberty, equality, and pizza. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln gave a speech that could have been the first political TED Talk. He talked about liberty, equality, and a unified nation, basically putting out a vibe that said, "Let's all play nice and not ruin this." Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was still insisting on liberty, but only for Southern whites. Lincoln was like, "Nah, we're talking equality for all." The final push, Grant versus Lee Grant, not one to give up, started moving toward Richmond in May 1864. He pursued General Lee's army across Virginia, and after 9 months of back and forth, the Union finally captured both Petersburg and Richmond on April 2, 1865. And in a final showdown at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee had no choice but to surrender. Grant, being the class act he was, let the Confederate soldiers go home without punishment. The end of the war, but not the drama. So, the war was officially over, but the effects stuck around for a long time. Around 250,000 Southerners and 360,000 Northerners had died. The notions of nullification and secession were now as dead as a doornail. Slavery was done for, but the struggle for equality was just getting started. The war was over, but the work was far from finished. Plot twist: the real battle for freedom and equality was about to begin. And now the recap. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily kept peace between free and slave states. But when the U.S. gained land from Mexico in 1848, the debate over slavery reignited. Northerners pushed to ban slavery in new territories, while Southerners argued for its expansion. The Wilmot Proviso was proposed but stalled, and popular sovereignty was suggested as a compromise. Tensions escalated with the formation of the Free Soil Party and California's admission as a free state, leading to the Compromise of 1850. This compromise allowed California in as a free state, but enforced a harsh Fugitive Slave Act. As violence erupted in Kansas, Bleeding Kansas became a symbol of the growing divide. The Dred Scott decision and the rise of the Republican Party in 1854 made matters worse, and John Brown's raid in 1859 further fueled Southern fears. By 1860, Abraham Lincoln's election led to Southern secession, and the Civil War began. The Union's strategic victories, like Grant's siege of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg, marked turning points. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation shifted the war's focus to freedom, and the Union's military strategy eventually wore down the Confederacy. After years of fighting, Lee surrendered to Grant in 1865, but the war's aftermath left lasting struggles for equality. There you have it, folks. That is sectionalism and Civil War nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Let's go nuts on those like and subscribe buttons for me. It'll really help us out here. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.